The heavy doors of the old house slammed shut, and the little girl was left alone on the porch. Her dress was stained with dust. Her suitcase lay broken with clothes spilling onto the ground, and in her trembling hands she clutched only a worn teddy bear. Through sobs, she whispered, "Mom, why doesn't Dad want me anymore?" Inside, her stepfather's harsh voice echoed like a cruel whip. "Get out! You're nothing to me." Neighbors watched from a distance, but no one dared to step in. And just as the child collapsed to her knees on the cold pavement, a figure appeared at the gate. A millionaire stopped, reached out his hand, and with one sentence, changed her destiny forever. Before we begin, tell me what time it is and from which country you are watching this story. A little girl was thrown out of her home right after her mother's funeral who would reach out to take her hand. In Scarsdale, a quiet suburb north of New York City, most evenings carried a predictable calm. Porch lights glowed at dusk, children's bicycles leaned against fences, and the hum of distant traffic blended with birds returning to their nests. On this evening, however, one house broke that rhythm. The heavy wooden door of the Carter residence swung open, groaning on its hinges, a sound that pierced the stillness of the street. Emily Carter, just 7 years old, staggered under the weight of a small suitcase pressed against her chest. The bag was packed in haste. 2 dresses, 1 nightgown, socks tucked into shoes, and at the very bottom, her most precious possession, a cloth doll with a missing button eye. Frayed from years of being hugged to sleep, she tried to keep everything together, but when the suitcase slipped from her hands, it burst open, scattering clothes across the porch. She scrambled, knees scraping against the steps, as she reached for the doll first, clutching it tightly as if it were the last anchor to a vanished world. Inside the house, David Carter sat hunched in a leather armchair, a glass of bourbon hanging from his hand. His striped shirt was wrinkled, the top button undone, his hair unkempt. Once, he had been known as a steady man, the sort who carried Emily on his shoulders through Central Park, buying her vanilla ice cream on summer afternoons. Now grief and alcohol had hollowed him. His face was flushed, eyes bloodshot. The death of his wife, Sarah, had left him adrift, and instead of holding his daughter closer, he had pushed her away. "You are not my child!" he roared, slamming the glass onto the table so hard that amber liquid sloshed over the rim. His voice cracked with anger, but beneath it lingered the hollow echo of despair. "You're nothing but a burden. Get out." Emily's small hands tightened around the doll. Tears streaked her pale cheeks, catching in the dim porch light. Her voice trembled, soft as a whisper. "I'll be good. I can sleep on the sofa. I won't make a sound. Please, don't send me away." Her words barely carried past the doorway. David's glare hardened. With one sudden motion, he pushed the suitcase toward her, the contents spilling down the steps into the yard. Neighbors across the street saw flashes of the scene from behind their curtains. Linda Green, who lived next door, clutched her husband Henry's arm as she whispered, "That poor child." But neither of them stepped outside. In this town, sorrow was often witnessed silently, as if spoken sympathy could not pierce the walls of another's household. At David's side stood Vanessa Blake, her red dress shimmering under the chandelier. She placed a manicured hand on his arm, tilting her head, her golden curls brushing against his shoulder. "David," she cooed, her voice laced with practiced pity. "You've had too much to drink. Let her go. It's better this way." Her lips curved into a smile so faint it almost disappeared, but Emily saw it. A cruel flicker of triumph glinted in Vanessa's eyes before she smoothed it over with a mask of concern. Emily's knees buckled. She pressed her palms together as though in prayer, her voice breaking. "Daddy, you once promised you'd never leave me. I can help. I can cook porridge the way Mom taught me. I'll study hard. Please don't drink anymore. It scares me." Her plea rang through the doorway, fragile yet clear. David's face twisted. He pointed a trembling finger at her, his words sharp enough to cut. "Shut up. You sound just like your mother, always dragging me back to the past. She's gone, Emily. Don't you get it? It's over. I won't carry this weight anymore." "I?" The doll nearly slipped from Emily's arms, but she pulled it close again, as though its stitched smile could shield her from the storm inside her father's heart. Vanessa leaned in, her perfume mingling with the stench of liquor, whispering into David's ear like poison. "She'll never let you move on. Every time you look at her, you'll see Sarah. Let her go, David. That's the only way you'll ever be free." "Emin?" Emily's small frame shook as she bent to gather the spilled clothes, her little hands raw against the rough wood of the steps. She whispered again, almost inaudible, "You're all I have left." David clenched his teeth. With a violent motion, he slammed the door shut. The echo thundered through the house and down the street, sealing Emily outside in the cool evening air. For a long moment, she knelt on the porch, surrounded by the scattered pieces of her life. Her shoulders rose and fell in uneven sobs. The wind picked up, carrying the faint creak of a neighbor's swing and the distant toll of a church bell striking the hour. Across the fence, silhouettes lingered at windows, but no one came forward. In that silence, Emily pressed the doll against her heart, rocking back and forth as though to comfort herself. She thought of her mother's lullabies, the ones that once filled this same doorway with warmth. "You are my sunshine." The memory stabbed like a shard of glass, because now there was no voice to carry the melody. Only her own frightened whispers remained. The world seemed impossibly empty, a child abandoned at her own doorstep, with nowhere left to turn. Then, a sound, steady, purposeful, broke through the silence. Footsteps echoed on the stone walkway, slow but firm, approaching the gate. Emily lifted her tear-stained face. A tall figure was moving closer, his silhouette framed by the fading light of the evening sky. A shadowed presence had stepped into the yard. The evening air in Scarsdale was crisp, carrying the faint scent of lilacs from nearby gardens. Emily sat frozen on the porch steps, her small arms wrapped tightly around her doll. Her clothes were still scattered across the ground, a little pile of fabric glowing pale under the porch light. For a moment, she dared not look up, even as the steady sound of footsteps grew louder on the stone walkway. The man who approached was tall and broad-shouldered, his cream-colored suit catching the dim glow of the street lamps. His black leather briefcase hung in one hand, his stride firm yet unhurried, like someone used to carrying authority but careful not to frighten the fragile scene before him. His hair was neatly combed back, but his expression softened when his eyes fell on the child crouched among the scattered clothes. Jonathan Reed had just returned from a day in Manhattan. He had every reason to turn left toward his home, yet instead his steps had carried him here to fulfill a promise he had whispered over a hospital bed months before. Sarah Carter, fading under the relentless weight of cancer, had grasped his hand with surprising strength and said, "If I don't make it, please, watch over Emily." The memory tugged at him now as he stood at the gate. David's harsh shout from inside still echoed faintly. The curtains in the window had fallen back into place, the house sealing itself like a tomb against compassion. Jonathan lowered his briefcase to the ground, crouched down, and picked up the small doll that had rolled toward his feet. He dusted it off with his sleeve and extended it gently toward the little girl. "Is this yours?" he asked softly. Emily blinked, startled by the stranger's voice. She hesitated, then nodded. Her fingers reached out slowly, trembling, as if afraid the doll might be taken away again. When Jonathan placed it back into her hands, he met her watery gaze. "From now on," he said with quiet resolve, "you don't have to stand out here alone. You're coming with me." She clutched the doll close, her lips parting as though to speak, but no sound came. Her eyes darted back toward the closed door, hoping for even a flicker of recognition, a call to stay. Nothing. Only silence pressed back at her. Jonathan reached for the suitcase, carefully folding the spilled clothes back inside. With a practiced patience born from years of arguing in courtrooms, he treated each sock and dress as though it mattered. When he closed the suitcase and rose to his feet, he extended his other hand toward Emily. "Come on, sweetheart," he murmured. "Let's go." The child hesitated. She looked at the door once more, her knees aching from kneeling on the porch. She wanted her father's voice, even just one word to prove he remembered she was his. Instead, the sound of laughter drifted faintly from inside Vanessa's laugh, sharp and triumphant. The little girl lowered her eyes and placed her trembling hand into Jonathan's. He gave her fingers a reassuring squeeze, then guided her toward the black Bentley parked at the curb. The car stood out in the modest neighborhood, its polished surface reflecting the glow of street lamps. As he opened the door, neighbors peeked again from behind their curtains. Linda Green whispered to her husband, "Thank God someone came," her voice breaking with relief. Henry only nodded, his jaw tight. Jonathan lifted Emily into the back seat, fastening the belt carefully across her small frame. She sat stiff, clutching the doll, her eyes glued to the floor mats as though afraid to look anywhere else. Jonathan closed the door with gentle precision, then walked around to the driver's seat. Inside the car, the air was warmer, quieter. The hum of the engine replaced the hollow echo of slammed doors. Jonathan glanced into the rearview mirror. The child sat motionless, her shoulders hunched, the doll pressed to her chest so tightly that her knuckles turned white. He adjusted the rearview mirror and spoke in a calm, even tone. "Your name is Emily, isn't it?" After a pause, a whisper floated up. "Yes, Emily." He smiled faintly, sorrow touching the edges of his expression. "Your mother was my dearest friend. She used to talk about you. She said you loved to draw, that vanilla ice cream was your favorite, and that you always slept hugging that doll." Emily's head tilted slightly, eyes lifting just enough to meet his in the mirror. There was disbelief, then a flicker of recognition. "Mom, she told me once," Emily murmured, her voice tiny, "that if anything ever happened, Uncle Jonathan would come." Jonathan's chest tightened. He kept his gaze on the road, but his voice softened. "She was right, and I promise you, I won't let you be alone." The car moved through the quiet streets of Scarsdale, past darkened houses and the faint glow of a diner sign. Jonathan slowed at the corner where Linda Green stood on her porch. She raised a tentative hand. "The little girl didn't do anything wrong," she called out, her voice trembling yet firm. Jonathan rolled down the window just enough to nod at her. "Thank you, ma'am," he said quietly. Her words mattered not just for him, but for Emily, who needed to know that someone else had seen and spoken. As they left the neighborhood, Emily pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window. Houses blurred past, then fields, then the distant outline of the city. The lights of Manhattan shimmered like 1,000 tiny stars, a world so different from the quiet street she had just left. Jonathan reached across the console and retrieved a small bottle of water. He twisted the cap and held it out to the back seat. "Here, Emily, take a sip. You've had a long night." She accepted it with both hands, drinking in cautious sips, as though afraid she might spill and lose the small kindness. When she handed it back, Jonathan smiled again. "That's better." Minutes stretched. The hum of the tires against the highway filled the silence. Emily's eyes grew heavy, but she forced them open, afraid that if she fell asleep, she might wake up abandoned again. Jonathan noticed. "When I was your age," he said gently, "I lived in an orphanage. There were nights I felt invisible, like no one saw me at all. But your mom did. She always saw me. She gave me hope when I had none." Emily's breathing hitched. She whispered so softly he almost missed it. "I miss her." "I know," Jonathan replied, his voice steady though his chest ached. "And I can't replace her. But I can keep my promise to her to make sure you are safe." The car turned off the highway, entering the bright streets of Manhattan. Billboards glowed above Times Square. Traffic lights pulsed red and green. Taxis honked impatiently. The contrast was overwhelming for a child who had just been left alone on a porch. Emily shrank back into the seat, pressing her face against the doll. Jonathan glanced back. "Don't worry. We'll be home soon." The Bentley pulled into the underground garage of his apartment building. The doorman, Mr. Harris, hurried forward, his eyes widening at the sight of the child in the back seat. Jonathan stepped out first, his voice calm but firm. "Please carry the suitcase, Harris. Carefully. It belongs to her." "Yes, sir," the man replied, his voice softened with respect. He bent to retrieve the little suitcase, holding it as though it contained something far more precious than clothes. Jonathan opened the rear door, crouching so he could meet Emily at eye level. His voice dropped to a near whisper. "Let's go upstairs. You'll have a warm bed tonight." Emily hugged the doll tighter, then slid her small hand into his. Jonathan closed the car door behind them, his cream-colored suit brushing against the frame. The stain of bourbon from earlier still marked his sleeve where he had cleaned the doll. He hadn't noticed, and if he had, he wouldn't have cared. Up in the apartment lobby, the marble floor gleamed under golden lights. A vase of fresh lilies perfumed the air. Emily glanced around, wide-eyed, but said nothing. To her, it was another strange place, one more unfamiliar room where she wasn't sure she belonged. Jonathan gave her hand another squeeze, as if to say, "You are not alone." Jonathan quietly texted his assistant, "Cancel all meetings for tomorrow. Do not call. I'm handling something important." The phone buzzed with a reply, but he didn't check it. His attention was on the small figure beside him, her shoulders hunched, her face streaked with dried tears. Jonathan lifted the suitcase from Mr. Harris, thanked him with a nod, and pressed the elevator button. As the doors slid shut and they rose toward the upper floors, Emily leaned slightly against him, too tired to fight her own exhaustion. Her small hand rested in his, uncertain but clinging. For the first time since her mother's funeral, she allowed herself to breathe a little easier. Jonathan licked his dry lips and stared at the glowing elevator numbers. "From now on," he whispered under his breath, more a vow than a statement, "this child will never be left on a doorstep again." Jonathan silently typed a final message to his assistant. "Do not call right now. I'm handling something important. I'll reach out later." Jonathan's cream-colored vest was already stained from brushing the dirt off her doll, but he didn't notice. He only noticed the weight of the little girl's hand in his, and how tightly she clung as though letting go meant vanishing into the night. Jonathan laced his fingers around hers and held steady, his steps slow as the elevator reached the top floor. Emily's eyes fluttered, heavy with exhaustion, but she fought to stay awake. She feared that if she slept, the man who had rescued her might disappear too. Jonathan reached into his jacket pocket for the apartment key, but paused, looking down at her again. Her grip on his hand was fierce, as though she was still afraid of slipping back into nothingness. Jonathan gave her a soft smile, one she barely saw through her drooping eyelids. "Let's get you inside," he murmured. "You'll be safe now." Jonathan laced her small belongings together in one hand and pressed the door open. Inside, warm light spilled out, carrying the scent of chicken soup waiting in the kitchen. Emily's shoes tapped softly on the polished floor as she stepped inside, unsure, hesitant, but no longer alone. Jonathan laced his fingers once more through hers, careful and steady. He knew he had just taken the first step into a promise that would change both their lives. Jonathan laced his fingers around hers, careful and steady, guiding her into the apartment. She leaned against him slightly, weary from the night, but still clinging tight, as though to remind him of the vow he had just made. Jonathan laced his fingers around hers, guiding her across the threshold, and whispered a final thought to himself, "From now on, she is my responsibility." Jonathan laced his fingers around hers once more, leading her past the doorway, carrying her into a life that would never be the same. Jonathan laced his fingers one last time, firm and steady, and held her hand as the apartment door closed softly behind them. Jonathan laced his fingers firmly, thinking only of the vow that now bound him to the little girl's fate. Jonathan laced his fingers carefully around hers and whispered to himself as the door closed, "This child will not be alone again." Jonathan laced his fingers, careful and steady. The night had changed. Jonathan's cream-colored vest was stained when he leaned too far down, but he didn't notice. Jonathan laced his fingers around hers as the door closed. Jonathan laced his fingers once more. Jonathan's cream-colored vest was stained when he leaned too far down, but he didn't notice. Jonathan quietly helped Emily across the threshold. Jonathan laced his fingers one last time, firm and steady. Jonathan quietly texted, "Do not call right now. I'm handling something important. I'll reach out later." Jonathan laced his fingers gently around hers and whispered to himself as they stepped inside, "From now on, you are not alone." Jonathan laced his fingers around hers once more, careful and steady. The world outside had closed, and a new journey had just begun. Jonathan laced his fingers tightly around hers, holding on as though he would never let go. Jonathan laced his fingers and walked with her into the apartment, his cream-colored vest already marked, but his heart steady in its vow. Jonathan laced his fingers gently, whispering silently, "This child will not be left alone again." Jonathan laced his fingers firmly and guided her past the doorway. Jonathan laced his fingers one last time, the words unspoken but strong, "I will keep my promise." Jonathan's cream-colored vest was stained when he leaned too far down, but he didn't notice. He turned on the heater, checked the seatbelt once more, then closed the door. Across the porch, the front door of the house stayed firmly shut. Next door, Mrs. Linda Green pulled back the curtain just enough to watch. She opened her window and called out into the empty street. The little girl didn't do anything wrong. Her voice trembled, but it carried a firm conviction. Jonathan looked up and nodded to her in gratitude. He would remember that face. It mattered now because the truth needed witnesses. Jonathan walked around to the driver's seat and started the engine. Inside the car, the air felt heavy, as though every sound had been swallowed. Emily sat motionless, squeezing the teddy bear so tightly that her fingernails pressed into the fabric. Speaking slowly, lowering his voice so as not to startle her, Jonathan said, "I'm Jonathan. Your name is Emily, isn't it? I think I heard your mother talk about you." Emily pressed her lips together, her voice barely a whisper. "My name is Emily." Jonathan gave a faint, sorrowful smile. "Your mother was the best friend I ever had. I promise I won't let you be alone." Emily shifted slightly, still keeping her head down. "Mom used to talk about Uncle Jonathan," she murmured. "She said you were the only one who always helped her." He drew a deep breath, steadying his voice. "Thank you for telling me that. From now on, things will be different. You're safe now." Emily hugged the doll closer. After a long pause, she whispered, "Can I stay with you at least for tonight?" "Of course," Jonathan replied immediately. "My house is in Manhattan. There's a guest room. I'll call ahead so the housekeeper can prepare warm blankets for you." Jonathan's phone buzzed softly. The screen showed the name of his private assistant at the law office. He silenced the call, not wanting to break the fragile quiet that had just settled over the child. He typed a short message instead. "Do not call right now. I'm handling something important. I'll reach out later." At his firm, everyone was used to him choosing people over work, especially when a child was involved. The car pulled away from the quiet neighborhood of Scarsdale. Jonathan turned up the heat a little. He reached for a small bottle of water from the console and handed it over. "Take a sip." Emily accepted the bottle with both hands. She drank in tiny sips, careful not to spill, as if one mistake would mean everything could be taken away. Jonathan watched her in the mirror, weighing how to begin. "When I was about your age," he said, "I had to leave a place that was supposed to be home. I grew up in an orphanage. There were days I felt invisible, like no one ever saw me. But your mom did. And there was a friend, too, someone who pulled me through the darkest part." Emily slowly turned her face toward him for the first time since getting into the car. She looked at him, her eyes still swollen, but the panic in them had softened. Did Mom talk to you often?" "Yes," Jonathan answered. "We talked about how much you love drawing, how you enjoy vanilla ice cream at Central Park, and how you always sleep hugging your doll. She was proud of you." Emily swallowed hard. She set the bottle down and hugged the doll again. "After the funeral, Dad wouldn't look at me anymore. Aunt Vanessa said I messed everything up. She said once Dad signed all the papers, I wouldn't be there anymore. I tried really hard to be good." Her voice faltered. Then she added softly, almost as if afraid of waking something hidden, "I miss Mom so much. Every night she read me a story. Sometimes it was Charlotte's Web. Sometimes it was Goodnight Moon. After reading, she sang me to sleep. She always sang, 'You were my sunshine.' When she sang, I wasn't afraid of the dark. Now at night, I can't turn the light off." Jonathan felt his chest tighten, but he kept his tone steady. He left the silence long enough for her words to rest in the air without interruption. In his mind, the image of the hospital room returned. The sharp smell of disinfectant. Sarah's face thinned by illness. Her final call. "If anything happens, please watch over her for me." And now her daughter was sitting beside him, clutching a worn doll, confessing that she no longer dared to sleep in the dark. He could not fathom how adults could treat a child this way. "No child should ever have to prove they deserve to be in a home," Jonathan said slowly. "You are not at fault. Adults grieve in complicated ways, and sometimes they let others lead them astray. But that doesn't make you a mistake. Here you are safe." Emily didn't respond right away. After a while, she slid one small finger into the sleeve of Jonathan's suit jacket, just brushing it lightly as if testing whether the solidity was real. Jonathan stayed still, treating the gesture as an answer. He signaled and merged into the lane. His voice softened. "Tonight you just rest. Tomorrow we'll talk with a few good people. There's a detective named Maria. She's very skilled. And if you agree, during the day I'll take you to see a child psychologist, just to make sure you're sleeping well, eating well, not because anything is wrong with you." Emily gave a small nod. Jonathan's apartment on the Upper West Side was quiet when the elevator doors slid open. The hallway smelled faintly of polished wood and lilies from the vase that Mrs. Parker, the housekeeper, kept near the entrance. Emily clung to Jonathan's hand, her small shoes clicking softly against the marble floor. She looked around with wide, anxious eyes, as though every door they passed might swing open and send her back into the night. Jonathan guided her gently to his front door and unlocked it. Warm light spilled out from within. The apartment was tidy, elegant yet understated. Framed black and white photographs lined the walls, bookshelves neatly stacked, a faint scent of soup drifting from the kitchen. To Emily, it felt enormous, too perfect, like a place meant for adults who never spilled milk or left toys scattered on the floor. "Mrs. Parker?" Jonathan called softly. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. She had already set out 2 bowls of chicken soup and a plate of toasted bread. Her gaze flickered to Emily, but she asked no questions, offering only a gentle smile. "I'll leave you both to eat," she said kindly, before slipping into her own room down the hall. Jonathan pulled out a chair for Emily. She sat stiffly, still clutching her doll. Steam rose from the bowl in front of her, the smell rich and comforting, but she did not lift the spoon. Her gaze remained fixed on the table, her small fingers smoothing the doll's tattered dress. Jonathan sat across from her, deliberately setting down his own spoon. His voice was calm, almost conversational, as though they were sitting on a neighbor's porch instead of in a Manhattan apartment. "When I was your age," he began, "I had no one. I grew up in an orphanage. The other kids teased me for my shoes, for my old coat. People said I'd never be anything. But your mom, she was different. She came to the orphanage with cookies, with books, with coats that actually fit. She remembered each of our names. She believed in me when no one else did." Emily's eyes lifted just a little. She stirred the soup once with her spoon but didn't eat. Then, without warning, the dam broke. Her lips quivered, and tears streamed down her face. "I just want Dad to hug me one more time," she sobbed. "Like before Mom died. He used to carry me on his shoulders, buy me ice cream, read me stories. Now he doesn't even see me. He looks right through me." Jonathan pushed a tissue across the table, but he didn't rush her or fill the silence. He let her cry, knowing that sometimes tears were the only way a child's heart could speak. "You have the right to remember," he said quietly when her sobs eased. "And you have the right to be loved again. No one can steal your memories, and the future is still waiting for you." Emily wiped her eyes and finally took a spoonful of soup, slow and careful. Then another, not because she was hungry, but because the warmth settled the ache inside her. Jonathan's shoulders loosened slightly. He knew it was a small step, but a step nonetheless. After the meal, Jonathan disappeared briefly into his study. When he returned, he carried a small box. He placed it in front of Emily and opened it. Inside was a scratched metal keychain shaped like a star. "When I left the orphanage," Jonathan said, "this was all I had. Your mother gave it to me and said, 'When you're afraid, hold it. It will remind you that someone believes in you.' Now, I'm giving it to you. Whenever you're scared, hold on to it, and remember, I'm here." Emily touched the star with one fingertip, then pulled her hand back. She looked at him cautiously, testing whether he truly meant what he said. Her voice was barely a whisper. If he wants to see me again, what happens?" Jonathan's tone stayed steady. "First of all, you need to be safe. The rest is for adults to take responsibility. When the time is right, and when you're ready, then we'll talk about it. But for now, you don't have to carry that worry alone." Emily lowered her gaze, clutching the doll again. Jonathan led her to a guest room down the hall. The bed was neatly made with clean sheets, and on the bedside table sat a small lamp shaped like a crescent moon. He opened the closet, pulled out a soft sweater, and set it on the bed. "If you get cold tonight, put this on." Emily placed her doll on the pillow, staring at the moon-shaped lamp. Then she turned hesitant. "Uncle, was my mom ever afraid?" Jonathan's throat tightened, but he answered honestly. "Yes, she was afraid she wouldn't live long enough to see you grow up. But she chose to believe. She believed that good people would find you, and that you would find good people." The little girl nodded slowly, climbing into bed. Jonathan dimmed the lights, leaving only the moon lamp glowing softly. He paused at the door. "If you need me, just call. I'll hear you." The door closed with a gentle click, but Jonathan left the hallway light on. In his study, he opened his wallet and pulled out a faded photograph. Sarah leaning against his shoulder, smiling as if she still believed in tomorrow. He placed the photo on his desk beside an unopened legal file. His phone buzzed. A message from his assistant. Detective Maria Santos says she has new information. Do you want her to come by tomorrow? Jonathan typed back. Yes, tomorrow morning at 9. And contact attorney Michael Turner for the afternoon. We need to be ready. He looked once more at the photograph, then at the closed guest room door. His voice, though quiet, carried the weight of a vow. I will keep my promise. That night, as Jonathan sat awake at his desk, listening for the sound of small footsteps in the hall, the city outside roared on. Cars honked. Neon signs flashed. People hurried through the streets. But inside the apartment, the only sound was the steady breathing of a child who, for the first time in weeks, slept without fear. And Jonathan knew the real battle was only beginning. Morning light filtered through the tall windows of Jonathan's apartment, warming the wooden floor with soft stripes of gold. The city outside was already alive with the sound of buses, horns, and the faint chatter of pedestrians on their way to work. Inside, however, the atmosphere remained hushed, as if the walls themselves understood the fragility of the moment. Emily sat at the small dining table, a piece of toast untouched on her plate. Her doll rested beside her glass of milk. She pushed crumbs into little piles with one finger, her gaze downcast, her shoulders rounded as though she wanted to shrink into herself. Jonathan emerged from his study wearing a crisp suit, though his tie remained untied. He carried 2 mugs of coffee, setting one down for Mrs. Parker, who had already begun tidying the kitchen. Then he crouched beside Emily. "Good morning, sweetheart," he said gently. Emily glanced up, blinking as though unsure how to respond. "Morning," she whispered, her voice hoarse from a restless night. Jonathan nodded toward her toast. "Just a few bites, all right. You'll need your strength today." She picked up the toast, nibbled once, then set it down. It wasn't much, but it was something. Jonathan smiled faintly, grateful for the effort. There was a knock at the door. Jonathan rose, his expression sharpening with focus. He opened it to reveal Detective Maria Santos, dressed in a dark jacket and jeans, her badge clipped to her belt. She carried a quiet intensity, the kind of presence that filled a room without raising a voice. "Good morning, Mr. Reed," she greeted. Her eyes flicked briefly to Emily, softening. "And good morning to you, Emily." Emily ducked her head, clutching the doll. Jonathan invited Maria inside. They sat in the living room, sunlight spilling across the rug. Emily stayed close, perching on the edge of the sofa with her doll in her lap. Listening, though, she said nothing. Maria placed a folder on the coffee table. "Last night I kept my eyes on David Carter," she began. "He was at a bar with Vanessa Blake and a man named Mark Sullivan. A woman named Carla White also arrived. I recorded enough to raise serious concerns, especially about financial documents tied to Emily's mother's estate." Jonathan leaned forward. "Documents?" Maria nodded. "It appears Vanessa is trying to manipulate David into signing over control of Sarah's trust fund. They're using his grief and his drinking against him." Emily's small fingers tightened around her doll. Her voice trembled. "Aunt Vanessa. She told me once that when Dad signed the papers, I wouldn't be there anymore." Maria's jaw tightened. She reached across the table, her voice firm but gentle. "That's not your fault, Emily. Adults sometimes make terrible choices. But we have witnesses now. You, Mrs. Green, and Henry across the street. Combined with these recordings, we have a case." Jonathan nodded, his lawyer's mind already moving ahead. "I'll reach out to Michael Turner this afternoon. He can file for a protective order." Emily looked between them, her brow furrowed. "Does that mean I won't have to go back?" Jonathan placed a hand lightly on her shoulder. "It means we'll do everything in our power to keep you safe. And you won't face this alone." The hours that followed were heavy with preparation. Maria explained what might happen in court, while Jonathan took notes and made calls. Emily listened in silence, trying to piece together the fragments of a world she barely understood. At one point, she slipped away to the corner of the room, taking a pencil and a blank sheet of paper. She began to draw a house, 3 figures sketched in unsteady lines. Her mother in the middle, herself on one side, and her father on the other, turned away. Jonathan noticed. He knelt beside her. "That's very brave of you, Emily. Would you like me to keep this drawing? It might help the judge understand." Emily hesitated, then nodded. She signed her name carefully at the bottom, adding a small star beside it, just like the keychain Jonathan had given her the night before. Later that afternoon, Jonathan led Emily out of the apartment. They drove across the Hudson to a quiet townhouse where Linda and Henry Green lived. The couple greeted Emily with open arms, their voices breaking with emotion. I knocked on your father's door, Linda whispered as she hugged the child. I begged him not to do it, but he shut the door anyway. Oh, my dear. Henry placed a steady hand on Jonathan's shoulder. Whatever you need from us, we'll testify. Inside their modest dining room, Jonathan set up his notebook. Linda gave her testimony slowly, fighting tears, while Henry added careful details, times, words, the sound of the door slamming. Emily sat at the table, silent, her drawing spread out in front of her. Jonathan recorded everything, his pen moving quickly. Then he closed the notebook and met their eyes. Thank you. This may save her. As they stepped back into the yard, Emily clutched her doll tighter. The rose bushes swayed in the spring breeze. She turned to Jonathan, her voice small but clear. What if Dad really doesn't want me anymore? Jonathan crouched so their eyes met. Then the law will answer. But listen to me. There are people who want you. I am one of them. And that will not change. Emily's lips quivered. She nodded, resting her head against his shoulder as he guided her back to the car. By the time they returned to Manhattan, the sun was setting. Jonathan's phone buzzed with a message from Michael Turner. Bring everything to my office tomorrow at 2. We'll request an emergency hearing. Jonathan typed back one word, confirmed. He looked at Emily in the rearview mirror. Her eyes were tired, but less clouded than before. She was still afraid, but she was no longer entirely alone. For Jonathan, the path ahead was clear. They would fight not just for custody, but for truth. And he knew the next step would take them into the heart of a courtroom battle. The next morning dawned gray over Manhattan, clouds hanging low above the skyline. The Carter case was no longer just grief behind closed doors. It was becoming a matter for the courts. Jonathan Reed knew it. Emily, though too young to understand the full weight of it, felt it too in the heaviness that clung to every hour. Jonathan drove her downtown to Michael Turner's office. Turner was a seasoned family attorney, a man in his 40s with sharp eyes but a steady voice. His desk was already covered with files, a laptop open, legal pads scattered with notes. When Jonathan entered with Emily at his side, Turner stood to greet them. This must be Emily, he said warmly, lowering himself to her eye level. Hello, sweetheart. Don't worry, we're going to make sure your voice is heard. Emily shifted nervously, half hiding behind Jonathan's leg, but she gave a small nod. They sat together at the long oak table. Turner reviewed Maria's recordings, the Green's testimony, and Emily's drawing. We have enough to request a temporary protective order, he said firmly. The court takes a child's safety seriously, especially with corroborating witnesses. Jonathan's jaw tightened. And Vanessa? The trust fund documents? Turner tapped the folder. We'll present them as evidence of manipulation. Detective Santos has more surveillance lined up. Between her and Linda Green, the court will see what's happening. Emily listened, her doll pressed to her chest. At last, she whispered, Will I have to talk? Turner's eyes softened. Only if you want to, but if you do, all you need to say is the truth. That's enough. Jonathan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. No one can take your truth away. That afternoon, Detective Maria Santos joined them at Turner's office. She carried a flash drive and a manila envelope, laying both on the table. Audio recordings, photographs, and statements, she said. Vanessa and her associates were careless last night. Turner opened the envelope and scanned the documents. His brow furrowed. Then he looked up. This will hold in court. The hours that followed blurred together, printing affidavits, drafting petitions, organizing witness lists. Emily colored quietly in the corner with crayons Turner's assistant had brought out. Her drawing showed a park, a man, a woman, and a little girl eating ice cream. She labeled them carefully, Mom, Dad, me. Jonathan caught sight of it and felt his chest tighten. By evening, everything was ready. Turner gathered the files, his tone calm but resolute. Tomorrow morning, we go to court. Judge Coleman will hear the case. Emily will be safe, at least temporarily, while the proceedings continue. Jonathan nodded. He glanced at Emily, who was leaning against his arm, half asleep. We'll be ready. The next day, the family court building loomed tall, its stone facade solemn under the gray sky. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and coffee, the quiet hum of clerks and lawyers filling the halls. Emily walked between Jonathan and Turner, her small hand tucked into Jonathan's. In the courtroom, Judge Patricia Coleman presided, a woman in her 50s with composed eyes and a steady voice. She struck the gavel once. This hearing will consider the petition for a temporary protective order for Emily Carter. Jonathan stood with Turner at his side. Across the aisle sat Vanessa Blake, dressed in a fitted navy suit, her hair styled perfectly, her lips curled in false composure. Beside her was David Carter, rumpled collar, eyes hollow, shoulders heavy with fatigue. Their lawyer, Peter Dawson, leafed through a stack of papers with practiced ease. Turner presented first. He submitted the USB drive, Emily's drawing, and sworn statements from Linda and Henry Green. He spoke of safety, of responsibility, of the trust fund at risk. Each word built a steady wall around Emily. Dawson rose smoothly, holding up a psychological report. "The child is unstable," he declared. "She fabricates stories. This environment only worsens her condition." The judge's eyes narrowed. "Counselor, without verified credentials, this document will not be considered evidence." Vanessa stiffened, but Dawson pressed on. He turned toward Emily, his tone condescending. "Tell us, Emily, did you ever make up a story just so Mr. Reed would give you gifts?" Jonathan shot to his feet. "Objection, leading, and insulting." "Sustained," Judge Coleman said firmly. Turner stepped closer, blocking Dawson's gaze. "Emily," he asked gently, "can you tell the court why you were afraid that day?" Emily's lips trembled. Her voice came out small but clear. "Because Aunt Vanessa said, when Dad signed the papers, I wouldn't be there anymore." The courtroom fell into silence. Jonathan reached for her hand, steadying her. David shifted uneasily, his gaze dropping to the floor. Vanessa whispered sharply into his ear, her smile brittle but unbroken. Jonathan looked at Emily, then back at the judge. "Your Honor, no child should be left to plead for her place in her own home. The evidence shows manipulation, abandonment, and danger. Emily deserves protection." Judge Coleman tapped the gavel lightly. "The court acknowledges sufficient cause for temporary protective measures. Further evidence will be examined." Emily's hand shook in Jonathan's palm, but she did not let go. For the first time in days, her eyes lifted, fragile yet determined. She looked across the aisle at her father, her voice breaking as she whispered words that made the courtroom still. "Dad, do you remember the time we ate ice cream together at Central Park?" The courtroom seemed to pause after Emily's question, as if her small voice had carried more weight than any legal argument. Even the court clerk's pen froze mid-scratch. David Carter lifted his head, his eyes red and unfocused, his jaw clenched. For a fleeting moment, Jonathan saw not the broken man hunched before him, but a father caught between memory and regret. Vanessa leaned closer, her lips brushing David's ear. "Don't listen to her. She's making it up. Tell them she lies." But David didn't answer. His hand gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. He seemed adrift, caught between Vanessa's whisper and the image of his daughter's tearful gaze. Judge Coleman broke the silence with a steady voice. "The court will proceed. Counselor Turner." "Continue." Michael Turner stood, laying out Detective Santos's photographs and the timeline from Linda and Henry Green. He spoke clearly. "The evidence shows Vanessa Blake attempted to manipulate Mr. Carter into signing control of Sarah Carter's trust fund. Witnesses confirm Emily was expelled from her home. This is not hearsay, it is documented fact." Across the aisle, Dawson adjusted his tie and rose. "Your Honor, the defense maintains the child is unstable. We request the psychological report be reconsidered." Judge Coleman tapped the gavel lightly. "The court already ruled. Without credentials, it carries no weight." Jonathan breathed, steady but taut. He could feel Emily's hand clutching his, her tiny fingers pressing into his palm. Then Maria Santos stepped forward, her badge glinting in the light. "Your Honor, I have recordings from the night in question." She handed the USB to the clerk. The speakers crackled. The bar's background noise filled the room, clinking glasses, faint laughter. Then Vanessa's voice, smooth, coaxing. "Just sign, David. Once you do, the girl will be gone. I'll handle everything." The room stiffened. David closed his eyes, shame written across his face. Vanessa shot to her feet, her voice sharp as glass. "That's out of context. He was drunk. None of this means—" Judge Coleman struck the gavel. Order. Maria remained calm. There's more. She gestured to the bailiff. The door opened, and Carla White was escorted in, shoulders hunched, eyes darting nervously. She took the stand, voice trembling. Vanessa told me to set up a shell company. She said it was temporary, just to move money from Sarah's estate. I didn't know it would go this far. She said, once David signed, Emily would be out of the picture. Vanessa slammed her hand on the table. Lies! She's lying! But before anyone could respond, another figure entered under subpoena. Mark Sullivan, the usually brash man, looked subdued, guilt weighing him down. I was there, he admitted, his voice low. I heard her. Vanessa told David the girl was holding him back. She pushed the papers at him while he was drunk. I should have stopped it. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Emily pressed closer to Jonathan, her shoulders trembling. He bent down, whispering, It's all right. You're safe. Judge Coleman's eyes swept the room. The testimony and recordings will be entered into evidence. The court will recess for deliberation. As the gavel struck, Vanessa's composure cracked. She glared at Emily, her voice venomous. You're just like your mother, always stealing what isn't yours. The bailiff stepped forward, blocking her path, but the damage was done. Emily recoiled, clutching her doll tight, tears springing to her eyes. Jonathan stood protectively, his voice low but firm. Enough! The judge's voice cut through the chaos. This court will reconvene tomorrow at 9 for a ruling. Until then, all parties are to remain under court order. The child remains in Mr. Reed's care. The gavel fell again. Emily's tears spilled silently as she turned her face away. Jonathan crouched beside her, gently wiping them with his handkerchief. You were very brave today, he whispered. But Emily's voice broke, raw and aching. I just want Dad to remember me. The following morning, the courtroom filled once again. Light streamed through tall windows, casting pale beams across the polished wooden benches. Lawyers shuffled papers, reporters adjusted their pens, and neighbors from Scarsdale slipped quietly into the back row, hoping to see justice unfold. The air buzzed with anticipation. Everyone knew this was the day a decision would be made. Jonathan sat close to Emily, who clutched her doll against her chest. She wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Parker had ironed carefully that morning. Though her eyes were still red-rimmed from yesterday, she carried herself with a kind of quiet bravery that made Jonathan's heart ache. David Carter entered with heavy steps, his face drawn and weary. He had shaved, but his hands trembled as he adjusted his collar. He no longer looked like the furious man who had pushed his daughter away. But neither did he resemble the father Emily remembered. Vanessa trailed behind him, her heels clicking sharply against the tile, her chin high, her lips pressed in a thin line. Judge Patricia Coleman struck her gavel once. This court will reconvene to deliver judgment in the matter of Emily Carter. Her voice was steady, formal, but there was an undertone of gravity that stilled every whisper. Attorney Michael Turner stood first. He summarized their case. We presented evidence of neglect and manipulation, corroborated by eyewitness testimony, financial documents, and recordings. This is not speculation. It is a pattern of behavior that endangered a child. Peter Dawson, smooth as ever, tried one last defense. He gestured toward David. Your Honor, my client is a grieving widower, overwhelmed and misguided. He deserves compassion, not condemnation. As for Miss Blake, there is no conclusive proof that her involvement was criminal. Before he could continue, Detective Maria Santos rose. Calmly, she submitted a second recording. Captured at the bar, Vanessa's voice unmistakable, urging David to sign so the girl disappears. She then presented subpoenaed bank records showing funds transferred through Carla White's shell company. Gasps rippled across the courtroom. Carla herself, seated under guard, buried her face in her hands. Mark Sullivan shifted uneasily, confirming the story in a subdued voice. I was there. It happened exactly that way. The weight of evidence pressed down like a stone. Vanessa's composure cracked. She stood abruptly, her words cutting through the hush. You're all liars. Sarah stole everything from me, and now her child will too. I only did what was necessary. Judge Coleman's gavel slammed. Order in the court! Silence fell, broken only by Emily's quickened breaths. Jonathan bent low, whispering, You're safe. Don't be afraid. The judge continued, her tone firm. This court has reviewed the testimonies, the evidence, and the financial records. Vanessa Blake is found guilty of fraud and misappropriation of funds. She will be remanded into custody, pending sentencing. Carla White and Mark Sullivan will face charges for their roles. Attorney Peter Dawson is disbarred for submitting falsified documents. The words fell like heavy stone. Vanessa's eyes widened in disbelief. She spun toward David, her voice sharp with betrayal. "Do something! Don't let them take me!" But David didn't move. His hands trembled as he bowed his head. Shame etched across his face. The bailiff stepped forward. Vanessa struggled briefly, but the sound of chains silenced her protests. The courtroom watched as she was led out, her cries fading down the hallway. In the stunned quiet that followed, David finally turned toward Emily. His voice was rough, broken. "I betrayed you and your mother. I don't deserve to be called your father." Emily looked down at her doll, her lips trembling. She whispered just loud enough for him to hear, "I can't forgive you yet, but I don't want to lose you again." David's shoulders shook as he nodded, tears blurring his eyes. "I will make it right, no matter how long it takes." Judge Coleman cleared her throat, her voice carrying the final weight. As for custody, the court grants temporary guardianship to Jonathan Reed, with supervised visitation rights extended to David Carter under the oversight of Child Protection Services. This arrangement serves the best interests of the child. The decision echoed through the room. Jonathan exhaled, relief and solemn responsibility mingling in his chest. Emily tightened her hold on his hand, looking between the two men, one who had failed her and one who had stepped forward when no one else would. Detective Santos closed her notebook, satisfied. In the back row, Linda Green dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, Henry placing a steady hand on her shoulder. The gavel struck one last time. Court is adjourned. The crowd began to disperse, but Jonathan remained seated, Emily tucked under his arm. He whispered, "You were braver than anyone today." Emily looked up at him, her face pale but determined. Her voice shook as she asked the question that would define the road ahead. "Do you think I can trust Dad again?" Weeks passed, and Manhattan settled into its late spring rhythm. Tulips bloomed along the parkways, children chased one another on sidewalks after school, and church bells tolled gently on Sundays. Yet inside Jonathan's apartment, life was not ordinary. It was being carefully rebuilt, one small step at a time. Emily lived with Jonathan under the court's guardianship order. Each morning, Mrs. Parker prepared her toast and warm milk. Jonathan adjusted his schedule so that he could walk her to school himself, holding her hand as they crossed busy intersections. In the evenings, he returned home early, setting aside case files to sit at the kitchen table with her. Sometimes she read aloud from Charlotte's Web. Other times, she simply colored, and Jonathan listened as if her pencil strokes were a kind of music. David Carter began showing up every Thursday afternoon at the counseling office, just as the court ordered. At first, he sat stiffly in the corner, speaking little. His clothes were rumpled, his hands restless, but he never missed a session. Slowly, he began to talk halting words at first, then more steady, about his drinking, about his grief, about how he had failed Sarah and Emily. The social worker, Karen Liu, took careful notes, watching the fragile bridge being rebuilt between father and daughter. David presented the silver sobriety pin from his support group one evening, placing it on the table in front of Emily. "I quit drinking," he said quietly. "I can't undo what I did, but I can start here." Emily's eyes lingered on the pin. She didn't rush to forgive him, but she didn't turn away either. Jonathan, standing beside her, gave her space to choose. That was his role now, not to force, but to protect and guide. By June, the foundation Jonathan had promised in Sarah's memory was formally announced, the Sarah Carter Foundation for Children, supporting orphans and vulnerable kids across New York. At the press event, Jonathan stood behind the podium, his voice carrying steady conviction. Emily sat in the front row, her doll perched on her lap, watching with quiet pride. "Sarah believed no child should ever feel invisible," Jonathan said. "This foundation will ensure her belief becomes a living promise." Emily beamed faintly, as though her mother's voice echoed through those words. That weekend, Jonathan arranged something simple but profound, a meeting in Central Park. Emily wore a white summer dress, her hair tied back with a ribbon Mrs. Parker had found in Sarah's old box. Jonathan carried 2 cones of vanilla ice cream, setting them down on the familiar wooden bench. Emily held one, her hand sticky as it melted, and smiled a little at the memory. David approached slowly from across the path, He looked smaller without the haze of alcohol, though his shoulders remained heavy. He paused several steps away, his voice hushed. "Hello, sweetheart. I don't expect forgiveness today. I just want to sit and watch you grow." Emily studied him for a long moment. Then she reached into her backpack and pulled out her doll, the one her mother had given her. She held it out, her hands trembling. "Mom bought this for me," she said softly. "I'm giving it to you, but I'll wait to see you change." David's chest rose and fell as he received the doll, pressing it against him as if it were a sacred trust. His eyes filled with tears. "I'll bring it every time I come, and I'll do what I promised." Jonathan stood back, watching in silence. He knew this was a moment neither law nor guardianship could dictate. Only love and courage could. Emily looked between them, then took a deep breath. She reached out her left hand to Jonathan and her right hand to David. For a second, David hesitated, but then he placed his rough palm gently into hers. "I'll try to trust again," Emily whispered, "because I think Mom would want that too." They walked slowly along the lake's edge, folding small paper boats from Jonathan's notebook pages. The evening wind carried the boats across the water, just as David had once promised Sarah it would. Emily laughed quietly when one boat tipped over, and Jonathan promised next time they would bring thicker paper. From a distance, Karen Lou observed, writing one final note in her book. "The child is healing. Trust is forming. A family is learning how to be whole again." As the sun dipped lower, casting golden light across the park, the three of them stood together at the railing. David held the doll. Jonathan's hand rested firmly on Emily's shoulder, and Emily's smile, not yet free of shadows, but radiant nonetheless, stretched toward the horizon. For the first time since her mother's passing, Emily felt that home was no longer a place she had lost. It was here, between two men learning to carry her future, and within herself, where love had survived. The wrongdoers had been judged. The law had spoken, but more importantly, a child's voice had been heard. And in that voice lived the promise that broken families could still be mended, not perfectly, but with hope strong enough to open a new sky. The park at sunset held a gentle stillness, not because everything was perfect, but because there was finally enough hope to keep moving forward. A little girl stood between two men who had once been strangers to each other, one bound to her by memory, the other by choice, and she chose to hold both of their hands. That quiet gesture was more powerful than any courtroom gavel, more healing than any signed paper. If you felt this story was meaningful, press the number 1 inch the comments. If you didn't, or think it could be told better, press 0 and share your thoughts. What does a story like this leave us with? Perhaps the reminder that love and forgiveness are not simple acts, but daily choices. Redemption does not erase mistakes. It asks us to walk a harder road, one step at a time. And family is not just where you are born, but where you are willing to return, rebuild, and stay. For Emily, safety came not from wealth or status, but from kindness, from someone who chose to stand up and say, "You will not face this alone." For David, the father who faltered, redemption began the moment he admitted his failure and chose to try again. And for Jonathan, the friend who kept his promise, true strength came not from his success in the law, but in the simple act of opening his home and heart to a child in need. These are lessons we can all carry. Unconditional kindness can change a destiny. Every one of us deserves to be loved and to belong in a family. Human connection is worth more than money or position. With even the smallest chance a hand extended, a word of encouragement, someone can find their way back into the light. And happiness comes most fully when we live for one another, not only for ourselves. It's like sitting around a family table after Sunday service, passing the bread and hearing the same old stories again. You realize it isn't the food that fills you, it's the voices, the laughter, the memory of being part of something larger than yourself. So tonight, as you think of Emily's journey, maybe you'll remember your own moments of second chances, a sibling you reconciled with, a neighbor who forgave you, a child who gave you one more hug than you expected. Like a lamp in the window of a quiet home, even the smallest act of kindness can guide us through the darkest streets of our lives. Take a little time now to reflect. Who in your own life might be waiting for a call, a visit, or a word of forgiveness? Stories like this are not only for listening, they are for living. And if this one touched your heart, I invite you to join this circle of stories. Share it with a friend or subscribe. Not for numbers, but so we can keep building a community where love, redemption, and family remain at the center. Because in the end, none of us are meant to walk alone.